If you're a church planter or want to plant a church, chances are you have or will plant a smaller church. In other words, very few churches start out large. Now, sometimes we can get discouraged and talk about all the things that we wish we had. However, there's a lot of advantages to a smaller church. And in fact, in this episode, we're going to give you 6 distinct advantages and strengths of smaller churches.
Welcome back to Practical Church Planting, where in 15 minutes or less, we'll give you practical tips, advice, and encouragement to help you plant and grow healthy churches. My name is Brian Adrosian, and joining me is Dylan Dotson, and today we're talking about 6 strengths of not larger, but smaller churches.
Yeah.
Which is weird.
Yeah.
Everyone wants a large church.
Yes, they do. And to be clear, we're not saying one is better than the other.
Yes.
But if you're listening to this, you're probably a church planter, want to plant a church. You might have a smaller church. I mean, statistically, most churches are like 200 people or less.
Yeah.
So this is relevant. And there are a lot of strengths to that. So instead of focusing on all the things that you wish you had, lean into what you have.
Yeah.
Because not all of us can be like the big boys. And Brian finds that really funny. So here we go. Here are 6 strengths. Number 1 is a strong sense of community. There is nothing quite like, I was thinking about this the other day, we live in Raleigh, so it's not necessarily a small town, but coming to a new city as a small, we're about 150-ish people, whatever, right now.
Yeah.
It's really a small town feel in the sense of like people really know each other. Totally. We have 2 services due to the size of our space, but like we come to our events, but there's like just a sense of community. Whereas if you're a larger church and you have a church-wide event, you might only know a few people. Like you're not going to show up knowing you're going to have someone to talk to.
Yeah.
Unless your friend is coming with you.
Yeah.
And so there's a strong sense of community in a smaller church that cannot be replicated when you grow. Now, it doesn't say you can't use groups or to do certain things to do community, but it's just much easier at a smaller church, and you can really make an impact in a lot of people's life with a strong sense of community, which is easier to formulate in a smaller church.
This is going to sound weird, but I feel like from an outsider's perspective, sometimes you can even think of that as a negative, because I think it's easy to think that a small church may become too like cliquey or too much of a strong community, if that doesn't really make sense, but that a newcomer is going to feel like an outsider, that everyone knows each other so well that a new person shows up and they're not going to feel like they connect. But what we've seen, at least, in our experience, is totally the opposite, that it is such a strong community, but as someone comes in, that community has been more than open to welcoming anyone in.
Yeah, and if some people want to stay anonymous, so it's hard to do at a smaller church, but also most people nowadays don't have friends.
Yeah.
And so it's super easy to connect when you have a strong community, when it's a smaller, people know each other better. Mm-hmm. If they know someone is new, they're more likely to reach out to them because they want them to feel welcome. We see that all the time here.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's a big strength that it's harder to keep up with the larger that you grow.
Yep.
Number 1, having a strong community. Number 2 is that there's a greater sense of ownership. So there's a greater sense of ownership among your people. Like, for example, if you have 20 hospitality volunteers serving and one person misses, so you have 19, you can fill it relatively easily. If you have 5 hospitality volunteers and one person calls out, then you have 4. That's 20%, right?
Yeah.
It's a much bigger deal. Now, not to say that one person that out of 20 doesn't matter. Of course, every role matters, but it feels like I'm needed much more because in some cases you can't get by without it.
Yeah.
That really your people at your church feel more so that this is my church, or it's easier to gain that ownership than it sometimes is as a big church, because you can feel like, well, they don't need me. Until you get more connected, you realize that's not true. But at a smaller church, people take ownership much quicker.
Yeah, and I feel like you're more likely at a smaller church to get not positions, but serving positions that you really wouldn't at a large church, which can help you take more of that ownership. Like we talked about in the past, how if you need someone to do like Insta stories or social media or something like that, at a small church, you can find someone to do it as a volunteer position that they probably never thought they'd be able to do for a church.
Right.
Where at a large church, they're not kind of going around asking people.
Right. And you need people that, especially the bigger it is, like the more trained they have to be, the better they have to be. It's easier to take those initial steps oftentimes at a small church, unless a large church does a really good job of getting people connected, which many of them do. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it's greater sense of ownership, which is really can help sometimes make a bigger impact in the community, and people invite their friends because they feel like this is my church, which is a big strength of a smaller church.
Yeah.
Number 3, it is easier for people to plug in. Mm-hmm. It just is. There's less systems, there's less steps. Again, not to say you can't do this at a large church, but it's harder to make sure the process is simple. But and we had an episode recently with Brittany walking us through the process. But because of the size that we are, if somebody comes up to me and says, hey, I want to serve, I can go up to Brittany. I probably still remember their name and say, hey, Brittany, this is the person that wants to serve. Whether or not they're with me or not, I can get their email and I can send it to Brittany. Mm-hmm. The larger the church that we get, the harder that is to come by and to just do. Now, you need to have a process. So you can't just rely on word of mouth. You need to have a process. But it's much easier for people to take steps. Because I think, like we said before, it's easier for them to see that there's a need sometimes. And it's just there's not as many steps when it's not as big, easier to get plugged in.
Yeah, I've had times when I was younger and attended larger churches where we'd be visiting a church and I'd fill out a Connect card and even be interested in serving, and it'd be a few weeks before I hear anything back. And
which, regardless of the size, that should not happen.
Yes,
but.
And don't get me wrong, there are large churches that do it much better than that. But by the time they contact me back, I'm like, not that I don't want to serve, but it comes across like, well, you can serve if you want to, but we don't really need you to serve. That's kind of the way it comes across. And so at a smaller church, it's much easier. Like you said, we contact them by Monday morning. Right. Or, it's much easier to do that follow-up than it is at a larger church.
Yeah, and at a smaller church, too, more people know where the holes are. So at a larger church, if someone wants to serve, they say, well, go talk to this person. Our church, now, sometimes people try to be overly helpful, which isn't always the best.
Yeah.
But they know where we have holes, where we have needs. And so sometimes they can help us get them filled with other people.
Yeah.
And it's just much easier for people to get plugged in at a smaller church. That's a strength. So we should lean into it.
Yep.
Number 4, that you have a higher percentage of generosity. In other words, kind of like with serving, at a smaller church where there's a higher sense of ownership per giving head or per person or per family unit, you're often going to get more generosity per person than you would as the church gets larger.
Yeah.
Now, that strength of that is we want people to be generous, not for the church's sake, but for their sake. And so when people feel like, oh, they actually need my contributions, they'll actually take more steps of faith to be generous. Mm-hmm. And so this is why, we talk about on the podcast at New City, the importance of talking about generosity a lot. If you're a smaller church, you just can't survive without it. Yeah. But people are much more likely to give and not feel like you just want their money at a smaller church because they can see that there's a big need there. So not only is that a good strength that you can help people walk in their generosity, but you need to know that you can do that and then people aren't going to feel weird about it because they see that it's a need. And so that's a strength that you can get more ownership financially, which is good for people's hearts at a smaller church.
Yeah, and like you said, we had an episode not terribly long ago, but I don't remember what episode it was, about how to or why to talk about giving more often. And so go back and listen to that. But basically, at a smaller church, it's going to be easier to talk about it more often because, like you said, people have more of that ownership. If it's a large church, you can talk. You should talk about it regardless of the size of your church because it's good for your people. But at a larger church, it's a little more difficult because it's like there's less of each individual person doesn't have as much ownership of the church, and then there's always that kind of sense of this is a sinful thought, but do you need it? Do you actually need me to give kind of thing? Where at a smaller church, there's no, it sounds bad, but there's nobody questioning if you need it. So it doesn't really.
I've never had a person at New City say, I don't know that you guys.
Right. It never really comes across as like pushy or desperate when you talk about it because people have a sense of ownership here and they have a sense of, yeah, this is my church, so it makes sense to give.
I've actually had the opposite happen where people were wondering if they should give to New City or to this other thing, and they gave to New City because they just assumed, which it is, it's probably true anyway, that we needed it more because we're a smaller, newer church plant. And so that's actually worked to our favor doing that. So a higher percentage of generosity among your people is a strength. Number 5, it's easier to try new things. And this may seem obvious,
more than anybody.
but we try a lot of new things here at New City. And as you grow, it's not that you can't try new things, but there's a little bit more weight to it. And there's a little bit more, there's a little bit more that you could lose by trying new things. Not to say that you shouldn't, but when you're smaller, everybody is a stronger relational capacity. Everyone knows each other a lot more. They're more forgiving when things don't work out, when things do work out. So this is why we say as a church plant, like, yes, you should, depending on what it is, you should give it some time before you kill it. Mm-hmm. But you should also take advantage, if you're a smaller growing church plant, of trying different things at the size that you are because you can't do it as much as you get bigger. So does this work? Does this not work? Don't feel like you have to wait a year to try something new every single time, because when you're smaller, you can try new things and get away with it, and it doesn't cause a lot of, uproar or anything like that because you're more mobile and fluid the smaller you are.
Yeah, and I would say it's not only easier to start new things, but to try new things, but you should try new things. Not to the sense where you're changing things every week, but I think if you're smaller, especially if you're have been around for a while and smaller, which not that that's a bad thing. If you're super rigid about what you do and nothing ever changes, I think eventually your people start looking at it and say, nothing's changing.
Right.
That's fine if we want to stay the way we are, but if we're talking about growing and things like that, but we're never doing anything different, it doesn't line up. It doesn't make sense. And so we should be trying new things, which is much easier to do when you're smaller.
Yeah. So that's the strength. Lean into that and just know that the bigger you get, as you kind of sometimes dream about bigger impact, and I'm saying in a selfish way, but just know you can't always try the things that you can try that now. Totally, and so lean into that. That's a strength that you can have. Yeah. And then number 6, lastly, pastoral care. Now, again, this isn't always true of bigger churches. It's just harder to make it be done well. Yep. But at a smaller church, it's easier for people to be connected to the pastor and or get help quicker because there's a lot more relational, equity between just the pastor and the people, but also among each other, because it's a smaller church. People know each other. Like I said earlier, it's kind of, I feel like New City is like a small town vibe in the city of Raleigh, because we all kind of know each other, those that have been here for a while.
Yeah.
And so it's easier to, sometimes it can be easier to get pastoral care. I noticed when we launched, I remember the first 2 years largely, until this year things have started to change, where I was always like, how come people like don't ask me, not that I know everything, but like I expected to have more like not counseling, but like I have this issue. And then I realized some of our people that came to New City as for relaunch were people who were part of a large church before. They weren't, things had happened, so they actually were not part of any church, and so they came here. It's not like they left the large church to come here.
Yeah.
But they were part of a large church for so long that some of these people had needs and had issues in their life, but they had just kind of been trained that, I don't ask for help, because maybe where they were at didn't have a good system of helping people.
Yeah.
And so people have had to like retrain them, like, no, if you have a need, we want to help you. We want to talk with you. We want to help you, see Jesus in your life. And it's much easier to do at a smaller church level, which Christ has called us to do. So lean into that, the fact that you can care for your people well, instead of feeling bad about it. That's a huge strength of a smaller church.
Yeah, I remember maybe a year ago, that's could be totally wrong, but I don't know if you remember. I remember on a Sunday during your message, you had talked about how people always assume that you're too busy to meet, and you said, and like it was during the message, you said like, I'm not too busy. Like you matter more than I don't remember how you phrased it, but I'm not too busy to meet. So if you need anything,
it's like this is my job,
right? This is, and so come, and so, but you can say that because you actually will, and not that people at a larger church won't, but because it's easier at our stage to meet with people. If you couldn't say that and then not take or not respond to the email the next day.
Right.
And so, yeah, I agree. It's not that you can't do it in a larger church, but it is a strength of a smaller
church.
Right.
I mean, we were probably, I don't know when that was. Were we at 2 services?
I don't remember.
I don't know. 80 to 120, we'll 80 to 100. Yeah. I don't know. And so, yeah, if you're a church of 5,000, you can't say because I didn't say the church will help you. I said, I'll help you. I think I was a little frustrated. I was like, why does nobody act like, I know you have issues. If we had a church of 5,000, that's not possible. Now, that's not to say you can't still say that at a church of 5,000. You just got to say, hey, like reach out to somebody.
There's a reason you have a pastoral staff.
But I was like, I'll help you. Yeah. I'll talk with you. I might not have an answer, but yeah, there's something that you can do as a smaller church. And so instead of running from that, like I said in the previous episode, like don't act like you can't. If you have 50 people at your church, answer your own emails and answer them like the next day. You don't need an assistant for that. And so, yeah, like just doing what you can do at a smaller church, the pastoral care ability is much easier and oftentimes can be much stronger at a smaller church. And that's a great strength to have.
Yeah. And pastoring people is, I think I would say, and maybe I'm wrong, and a pastor of a large church can email me and tell me I'm wrong. But I would say one thing that pastors of a larger church may envy a little bit about a smaller church is that they maybe don't get to personally pastor, I guess you could say, like they used to, or like they did when they were smaller. And that's not to say that smaller is better than larger by any means, but I think that if you're a pastor, you genuinely, generally have that desire to want to pastor people and want to have that one-on-one with people. And so it just gets harder when you get bigger.
That's good. So again, these are the 6 strengths of small churches among many to encourage you and us that you can have stronger community, greater sense of ownership, easier for people to plug in, a higher percentage of generosity among your people. It's easier to try new things, and pastoral care can also be a strength as well. So thanks for listening. As always, if you want to leave a rating and review or share this to any of your ministry friends, we would love that. Join the Facebook group, Practical Church Planning. That's always fun.
Sure is.
And subscribe if you haven't.
Yes.
Thanks for being with us. We won't be with you if you're listening to this chronologically on Thursday because it's July 4th. Happy birthday, America, but we'll be with you next week on Practical Church Planning. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Practical Church Planning. Whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube or Practical Planning, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make sure you like or subscribe or do whatever it's telling you to do or should do on that platform.
And hey, if you are so tired of looking at our ugly faces, but you're not tired of listening to our beautiful voices, then you can find our podcast if you just search Practical Church Planning on iTunes or Google Play. Make sure not to just find it, not just to listen, but to subscribe.
Make sure you subscribe. Brian, tell them to subscribe.
Subscribe.
See you next time.